The flight crossed the mountains in silence. White peaks filled the windows. The wreck stopped moving. In the early days of October 1972, the southern spring in South America was just beginning to soften the cold edges of winter. The Andes still wore their frozen crown, colossal ridges of white and blue ice that cut the sky like the jagged teeth of some ancient creature. It was into this rugged wilderness that a Fairchild FH227D twin-engine turboprop prepared to make what, on paper, looked like an ordinary charter flight. On the morning of October 12, inside Carrasco International Airport in Montevideo, Uruguay, a group of young men in neat blue rugby jackets clustered near the departure gate. They were the Old Christians Club, most of them university students, boys in their late teens and early 20s, brimming with humor and restless energy. Some carried guitars slung over their shoulders. Others joked about the upcoming friendly match in Santiago, Chile. The trip promised camaraderie, adventure, a story to tell when they returned. Among them was Nando Parrado, 22, tall and athletic, his dark hair brushing the collar of his jacket. Quiet by nature, he often let the louder teammates fill the air with jokes. His mother and younger sister, Eugenia, had joined the team on this excursion, a rare chance for the women to watch the game and enjoy the Chilean capital together. Another passenger, Roberto Canesa, 21, a medical student who had a reputation for quick thinking and calm under stress, carried with him a small bag of textbooks. He thought perhaps he'd review some notes during the flight. The rugby team's captain, Marcelo Perez, projected the steady confidence of a natural leader. He moved easily among his friends, patting shoulders, making last-minute checks that everyone's luggage was accounted for. There were 45 people on the manifest, players, relatives, and a small flight crew led by Captain Julio Ferradas, an experienced pilot who knew the Andes well, and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Dante Lagurrara. The plane lifted off with a gentle shudder of its propellers. Looking out the oval windows, the young men saw Montevideo's green outskirts fall away toward the wide brown sweep of the Rio de la Plata. The laughter in the cabin was bright, untroubled. Someone strummed a guitar. Another teased a friend about how clumsy he'd be on the field after sitting too long. For the first leg to Mendoza, Argentina, the flight was smooth. That evening they landed, stretched their legs, ate dinner, and rested in a modest hotel. The plan was to cross the Andes the next day, weather permitting. By mid-morning on October 13, the passengers filed back aboard. The mood was light. A thin, silvery sunlight lanced through patches of cloud outside. Few of them paid attention to the jagged peaks that loomed to the west. The Andes, though beautiful, are notoriously treacherous for aviators. Sudden storms can sweep across the passes, and powerful downdrafts can drag an aircraft into valleys like an invisible fist. The pilots studied their charts and weather bulletins. Captain Ferradas was confident. The flight to Santiago would take barely 90 minutes. As the Fairchild climbed, the cabin filled with chatter. About girlfriends back home, about who might score first in the match, about the thrill of flying so close to the snowy mountaintops. Through the windows they could see sunlit glaciers spilling down sheer slopes, then plunging into deep valleys swathed in cloud. Somewhere near the spine of the Andes, clouds began to gather more thickly, soft but impenetrable. The mountains ahead were swallowed by mist, their outlines fading like ghosts. The pilots throttled back slightly, dipping lower in search of a safe pass. Radio beacons in that region were unreliable, and the cockpit relied heavily on dead reckoning, judging position by time, compass and glimpses of the terrain below. In the cabin, the team hardly noticed the subtle turbulence. A few who did shrugged it off. Nando, by the window, gazed at a patch of pale sun breaking through the clouds, unaware of the storm-shrouded peaks lying ahead. As they crossed the frontier between Argentina and Chile, a stiff tailwind pushed them along faster than estimated. Co-pilot La Gurara believed they had already cleared the highest ridges and started a gentle descent toward Curicó Valley, the Chilean side of the range. Captain Ferraras, trusting the calculation, began to lower altitude, expecting to emerge over gentler terrain. But they were still in the heart of the mountains. Beneath the cloud cover rose ridges above 13,000 feet, unseen in the gray curtain. At approximately 3:34 p.m., the Fairchild banked slightly, dropping through a break in the clouds, only for the pilots to glimpse, horrifyingly close, a towering, snow-armored peak. Captain Ferradas hauled back on the yoke, engines screaming. The aircraft clawed for altitude, but the mountain rose faster than they could climb. A tremor ran through the fuselage as the right wingtip clipped a ridge of rock. The impact tore the wing away, sending it cartwheeling into space. The aircraft lurched sideways, screaming metal and splintering seats. Seconds later, the left wing struck another outcrop and sheared off. The tail section detached entirely, vanishing into the white void behind them. What remained of the fuselage, now a narrow cylinder of torn aluminum, continued forward like a sled, skidding down a long icy slope at tremendous speed. The boys screamed. Snow and debris blasted through gaps in the shattered windows. At last, after several hundred meters of sliding descent, the fuselage slammed to a halt against a mound of packed snow. Then there was only the hiss of wind and the groans of the injured. Inside the tilted cabin, daylight streamed through ragged holes where the wings had been. It was bitterly cold. Moans rose from the wounded. Others sat frozen in shock. Several passengers had died instantly in the collision, including the team's beloved coach and a few of the boys' closest friends. Nando's mother was among them. His sister, Eugenia, lay gravely injured beside him. In those stunned minutes after the crash, none of the survivors could yet imagine the ordeal that lay ahead. 72 days trapped in the frozen Andes, cut off from the world. For a few stunned moments after the fuselage came to rest, no one moved. The silence that followed the crash was almost unreal, a hush broken only by the rasp of wind against torn aluminum and the soft cries of those still conscious. The survivors slowly gathered themselves, crawling out from under ripped seats and scattered luggage. The air was thin and painfully cold. Each breath burned their lungs. Through the broken windows they could see nothing but blinding white snow and the dark, jagged silhouettes of the Andes pressing close on every side. Marcelo Perez, the team's captain, instinctively began to take charge. He and a few of the older players checked on the injured, while others searched for blankets and anything useful among the wreckage. In the absence of the cockpit and wings, the main fuselage became their only shelter, a hollow aluminum tube resting at a steep tilt on a slope of snow. Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Cerbino, both medical students, quickly turned into field medics. They tore strips from seat covers to make crude bandages, splinted broken limbs with pieces of aluminum struts, and tried to stop the bleeding of deep gashes. There was no morphine, no proper antiseptic, only ingenuity and steady hands. The dead were gently moved to one side of the snow outside the fuselage, covered with jackets or a thin layer of ice. For the first night, the living huddled together inside the wreck, pressing their bodies close for warmth as the temperature dropped to nearly minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Food was scarce, only a few chocolate bars, some bottles of wine, peanuts, and a handful of assorted snacks from the passengers' bags. Divided among the 30-odd survivors, it was barely enough for a single meal. The second day brought no sign of rescue. A few ventured outside, shielding their eyes against the glare of the snow. They saw that the plane had come down in a narrow glacial valley, hemmed in by steep peaks that seemed to scrape the sky. There was no visible trail, no trees, no life, only endless ridges of ice and snow stretching to the horizon. The radio in the cockpit was gone, torn away with the missing nose section. What remained of the small battery-powered transistor radio could still pick up faint broadcasts from Uruguay and Chile. Late that afternoon, as they huddled together to listen, a ripple of hope passed through them. They heard that search and rescue missions were being conducted. The outside world was looking for them. But as the days dragged on, that hope began to fray. Each time the drone of an aircraft echoed faintly over the valley, everyone scrambled outside, waving pieces of cloth or reflective metal. Each time the plane passed by without noticing them, the valley fell silent again. On the 8th day, the radio delivered the news they had dreaded. The official search had been called off. The authorities believed there were no survivors left to find. The voice from the tiny speaker, barely audible over the static, felt like a death sentence. That night, despair gripped the group. Some wept quietly, others prayed in whispers. Marcelo Perez urged them not to give up, to conserve their strength and continue rationing the few scraps of food. Snow fell heavily the next morning, piling against the fuselage door they had improvised from luggage and scraps of metal. With every passing day, the weather seemed to grow harsher. On the 17th day after the crash, as they began to settle into a grim routine, disaster struck again. A sudden avalanche roared down from the slopes above, smashing into the fuselage during the night. The survivors were jolted awake by the deafening rush of snow as it burst through the openings, burying them under a crushing white weight. Men clawed frantically at the snow with bare hands, struggling to breathe, to find each other in the darkness. When the avalanche finally settled, more lives had been lost. Some who had endured the crash itself now suffocated within arm's reach of their friends. The survivors dug desperately to reopen an air hole in the packed snow and clear a path to the outside. When they finally emerged, gasping in the thin mountain air, they saw that the fuselage was now half buried, like the hull of a ship trapped in ice. Inside, they faced a grim arithmetic: fewer hands to share the labor of survival, and fewer rations than before. The little chocolate and wine were nearly gone. They melted snow for water, using strips of metal as crude pans, warming them with the brief heat of the high-altitude sun. Nights remained cruelly long and frigid. Huddled together in darkness, they shared stories about home, about girlfriends and families, trying to keep alive a sense of humanity amid the unbroken white wilderness. Nando Parrado drifted in and out of consciousness beside his sister, who was weakening from her injuries. He himself had suffered a head wound during the crash and spent days in a daze, but grief slowly burned through the fog. His mother had died, and his sister's life hung by a thread. In those early weeks, time began to blur. The once vibrant rugby team was now a band of gaunt young men, their lips cracked from the cold, their eyes sunken, yet still lit by a stubborn spark, the instinct to survive. As the Andes tightened their icy grip around the fuselage, the survivors knew they could no longer wait passively for rescue. Something would have to change, some decision that would test their courage and their very humanity. By the third week after the crash, the Andes had stripped away every comfort and every illusion. The once boisterous rugby team had become a group of hollow-eyed figures who measured their days by the movement of the sun across the valley wall. The food they had salvaged was long gone. They had scraped clean the last crumbs of chocolate, shared the final drops of wine, even chewed on strips of leather from luggage in the desperate hope it might trick the stomach into feeling full. Yet the hunger gnawed deeper with each passing day. The men were growing weaker. Some could barely stand, and the thin air at over 3,600 meters, 12,000 feet, left them breathless after only a few steps. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes, lips cracked until they bled. In the cold silences of the night, prayers mingled with the sound of the mountain wind. They prayed for a miracle, for the thrum of a helicopter in the distance, for a hiker to crest a ridge, for anything that might mean the world had not forgotten them. But the snowfields stretched out for miles without a sign of life, and the radio, still their one fragile tether to civilization, offered only the voices of newsreaders discussing politics, sports scores, distant weather reports. No mention of the Andes survivors. One evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple over the peaks, Roberto Canessa finally voiced the thought that had been silently haunting many of them. Sitting huddled beside Nando Parado, he said in a low, shaking voice, "If we don't find food, we will all die here. The bodies of those who've gone, they could save the rest of us." The words hung in the air like a blasphemy. Some turned away in shock, others shook their heads violently. No one wanted to speak of it, but the logic was undeniable. There was no other source of nourishment in the barren white desert around them. Over the next days, the subject surfaced again and again, mostly in whispers. Marcelo Perez, their captain, called a meeting in the cramped fuselage. The men debated in halting voices, torn between revulsion and the instinct to survive. Some quoted scripture, others wept quietly, their gaunt faces hollowed by hunger. They decided collectively and solemnly that if any among them were to perish, the bodies could be used to sustain the living. They would regard it not as desecration, but as a final act of sacrifice. Many prayed for forgiveness before taking the first reluctant steps toward that choice. In the days that followed, the survivors began to ration even that grim resource carefully, sharing small portions to preserve their strength without losing their humanity. They spoke often of the dead as companions still traveling with them, not as strangers lost to the snow. Despite the meager sustenance, their energy remained dangerously low. Frostbite advanced, lips and cheeks burned raw from the reflection of sun on snow. They learned to cut narrow strips of aluminum from the wreck to fashion crude sunglasses, reducing the glare that seared their eyes. A handful of the stronger men took it upon themselves to explore the nearby ridges in hopes of spotting a route out of the valley. Nando Parado, slowly recovering from his head injury and the grief of losing his mother and sister, began to regain his strength. The need for action gave him purpose. Exploration parties climbed the slopes, but each time they found only more endless white, peaks rising like walls of ice. The valley, they realized, was surrounded by ridges towering over 14,000 feet, impossible to cross without better gear or supplies. Through it all, leadership shifted naturally to those most level-headed, Marcelo Perez, Canessa, and Parado along them. They kept the group united, organizing watches to keep snow from sealing the fuselage door, melting ice for water, and tending the sick. Their camaraderie, once built on rugby field banter, was now forged in survival. They learned to speak gently to those on the edge of despair, to sing soft hymns at night, to remind one another that each sunrise was another small victory. Then came the avalanche, its memory still raw. The men who survived it often awoke in the dark, gasping for breath, reliving the sensation of snow filling their lungs. The loss of more friends had deepened their sorrow, but also stiffened their resolve. Their survival would honor the ones they'd lost. One frigid morning, the sun struck the snow so brightly that it hurt to look outside. From their shelter, the men could see distant ridges gleaming under the thin blue sky. That sight rekindled the discussion. Someone would have to go for help. It was a daunting idea. The journey would mean crossing unknown mountains with no maps, little food, and almost no protection from the elements. But staying in the valley much longer meant certain death for everyone. Nando Parado, driven by the memory of his mother's last words and the desire to save the others, volunteered. Roberto Canessa, who had become the unofficial medic, joined him. They began to prepare in secret, collecting scraps of fabric to sew into a makeshift sleeping bag, cutting pieces of insulation from the plane for added warmth, and saving the most caloric bits of ration they had. During these preparations, they also built up their strength with short practice hikes near the fuselage, though the thin air and their weakened bodies made even 100 yards of uphill snow exhausting. The rest of the group watched with a mix of hope and dread, understanding that the two young men were their best chance, perhaps their only chance, of bringing back help. As the 50th day since the crash approached, the air grew slightly warmer with the advancing southern summer. The snow crust softened in daylight, then froze again to ice at night. It was a narrow window when the weather might be kind enough to attempt the journey. On the night before their departure, the survivors gathered in the fuselage, their faces drawn but their eyes bright with a fragile flame of hope. They prayed together, sang a hymn, and exchanged quiet words of encouragement. In that moment, amid the cracked aluminum walls and the scent of melted snow, they were no longer merely passengers of a doomed flight. They had become a brotherhood bound by suffering and faith in one another. At dawn on December 12, 1972, the sky over the valley was a pale steel blue, the kind that promised a few clear hours before the winds would sweep in again. Thin wisps of clouds stretched like torn gauze over the peaks. The survivors stirred early, their breath visible in the freezing air, hearts beating faster at the knowledge that two of their own would soon step into the unknown. Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa rose quietly. Their bodies were lean but firmer now, hardened by weeks of brutal mountain living. They wrapped themselves in layers of salvaged clothing, sweaters, cotton shirts, bits of insulation, even pieces of seat fabric stitched together. Their footwear was a patchwork of shoes reinforced with scraps of metal and cloth to give traction on ice. The sleeping bag they carried was a masterpiece of necessity, stitched from the lining of the airplane seat covers and stuffed with whatever thin padding they could find. Inside it, they packed a tiny reserve of food, a few morsels saved from the fuselage, barely enough for a handful of meals. Before they left, Each man clasped hands with the others, promising to return with help. The group's faces reflected a fragile blend of pride and fear. They all knew that the two might not survive the journey, but no one voiced it aloud. The climb began at mid-morning. The snow was crusted hard enough to hold their weight, sparing them from sinking knee-deep at every step. But the thin air at altitudes above 12,000 feet burned their lungs, and the glare of the sun forced them to keep their makeshift sunglasses in place. The first hours were steep. They leaned forward into the incline, planting each step carefully, using shards of metal as improvised walking sticks. Behind them, the fuselage grew smaller, a dull silver speck against the wide white basin of the valley. From that height, the Andes revealed themselves in their full majesty. Mountains piled upon mountains, jagged ridges wrapped in glaciers that glittered like powdered glass in the sunlight. The immensity was both breathtaking and terrifying. They camped the first night on a small plateau, burrowing into a hollow of snow to shield themselves from the wind. Inside the sleeping bag, they lay pressed back to back for warmth, drifting in and out of uneasy sleep beneath the alien brilliance of a high-altitude night sky. The stars felt so close it was as if they might reach out and brush them with their frost-bitten fingers. At dawn, they set off again, aiming for a saddle between two peaks that they hoped would lead down toward Chile. But the slope ahead was steeper than it had appeared from below, an illusion of distance in the clear mountain air. They trudged upward for hours, muscles screaming, lungs heaving with each breath. On the third day, as they crested yet another ridge, they were met not with a descent, but with another vast stretch of mountains. It was a demoralizing sight, ridge after ridge fading into the horizon, as if the Andes were infinite.
Nando and Roberto paused, leaning on their makeshift poles, trying to summon courage. Their faces were sunburned, lips cracked and bleeding. They drank melted snow sparingly to conserve strength, knowing dehydration would sap them faster than hunger. They pressed on. Day after day they advanced like ants across the frozen spine of the continent, covering a few miles that felt like entire worlds. Meanwhile, back at the fuselage, the others waited in suspense. They passed the days in chores, melting snow for water, clearing ice from the doorway, trying not to dwell on the uncertainty of their friend's fate. Each sunset brought questions. Had the pair survived another night? Were they closer to help or lost forever among the peaks? Out on the mountains, Nando and Roberto finally began to see signs of change. By the sixth day, the white expanse gave way to patches of rock and sparse tufts of brown grass. The sight of vegetation after 2 months of unbroken snow brought tears to their eyes. It was proof they were descending, that life still existed somewhere below. One afternoon, they discovered a narrow trickle of water flowing under a thin sheet of ice. They knelt to drink deeply, letting the icy water soothe their cracked throats. By the 9th day, they reached the edge of a river valley. The terrain softened into rolling hills scattered with scrub and the occasional boulder. The snow line was now high above them, a white collar draped on distant peaks. Exhausted, with their last scraps of food gone, they stumbled onward, driven by the faint hope of seeing another human face. On the 10th day, as they followed the curve of a river, they spotted something that stopped them in their tracks, a dark figure on horseback on the far side of the rushing water. For a moment they thought it a mirage born of hunger and fatigue. But the figure was real. Sergio Catalan, a Chilean muleteer tending his animals along the riverbank. Nando and Roberto shouted hoarsely across the water, waving their arms. Their words were torn away by the wind and the roar of the river, but their desperation was unmistakable. Catalan stared in astonishment at the ragged, sunburned figures who looked as though they had come from another world. Unable to cross the river immediately, he gestured that he understood and would return. He galloped away to seek help.
That night, as the two survivors huddled by the river's edge under a sky brimming with stars, they felt the first surge of true hope since the crash. Somewhere out there, they knew, someone now carried their story to the rest of the world. Back at the fuselage, the others would soon see helicopters cresting the horizon. But on this night, in the valley where the snow met the river, two young men who had walked out of the jaws of death dared to believe in life again. At dawn the next day, the river valley was wrapped in a low mist, and the morning air smelled faintly of grass and wet stone, an aroma that felt almost luxurious after weeks of sterile snow. Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa awoke stiff and sore, but buoyed by the memory of the horsemen they had seen. Somewhere out there, they hoped, help was already on the way. By midday, a distant sound broke the quiet, the rhythmic thud of hooves on rocky ground. Sergio Catalan returned, this time with another man on horseback. Across the rushing river, he shouted words of encouragement in Spanish, then tied a piece of paper and a pencil to a rock wrapped in plastic. He hurled it skillfully across the water. On the scrap of paper, Catalan had written, "Tell me who you are and what has happened." Nando scrawled a trembling reply. "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have 14 more wounded people on the mountain. We need help. We have not eaten for many days." He wrapped the note back around the stone and flung it across the river. Catalan nodded gravely, tucked the message away, and galloped off toward the nearest outpost to alert the authorities. For Nando and Roberto, that moment, watching the horsemen disappear into the folds of the valley, was like witnessing the turning of a great wheel of fate. They were no longer alone. The following day, Chilean military authorities received the astonishing message. Soon the story flashed across radios. Survivors of the lost Uruguayan plane had been found alive after more than 2 months in the Andes. On the mountain, meanwhile, the remaining 14 survivors gathered in the half-buried fuselage, their faces gaunt, but their spirits fragile with hope. Each day they scanned the sky for the first sign of approaching aircraft. 2 days after Catalan had delivered the message, the distant thunder of helicopter blades reached the valley where Nando and Roberto waited. A green and white rescue helicopter emerged from the clouds, banking low over the river before settling on a narrow patch of earth. The two men staggered toward it, shielding their eyes against the spray of snow and dust. Chilean rescuers jumped down, their faces full of disbelief as they took in the skeletal, sunburned figures who had survived the impossible. After a brief examination, the rescuers helped Nando and Roberto aboard. The helicopter's cabin was warm and smelled of engine oil, a scent that would forever remind them of salvation. As the rotor lifted them into the air, Nando gazed back at the river valley, a lump rising in his throat. The mountains that had seemed to trap them now slipped away beneath the spinning blades. The helicopter flew them to a small outpost, where medics gave them water, bread, and warm blankets. They were too weak to eat much at first, but the taste of fresh bread after 70 days of deprivation felt almost unreal. The next morning, December 22, a full-scale rescue mission was launched. 2 Chilean military helicopters, guided by Nando and Roberto, headed back toward the crash site. The weather was marginal, but clear enough to attempt a landing on a flat patch of snow near the fuselage. High on the mountain, the remaining survivors heard the distant chop of rotor blades. They scrambled out of the fuselage, waving tattered cloths and shouting through cracked voices. The sight of the green helicopters cresting the ridge brought many of them to their knees in tears. The landing was precarious. The rotors churned up clouds of snow that swirled around the shivering survivors. Rescuers leapt out, hugging the stunned men one by one before helping them aboard. The first helicopter ferried half of the group down the mountain, leaving the others to wait as the aircraft returned for the second run. Those who remained endured one final anxious night in the fuselage, but it was a night suffused with the knowledge that their ordeal was truly ending. By December 23, all 16 survivors were airlifted to safety. Ambulances whisked them to hospitals in San Fernando and Santiago, where doctors marveled at their resilience. Families who had long since mourned their deaths wept as they reunited. News of the miracle in the Andes spread swiftly across the globe. Newspaper headlines from New York to Paris marveled at the courage of the survivors and the extraordinary trek of Parado and Canessa. Reporters crowded hospital corridors, hoping for interviews, but many of the men were too weak to speak for long. They asked, above all, for privacy, to grieve those they had lost. Back at the crash site, Chilean authorities marked the place as a grave for the 29 who had perished, erecting a simple wooden cross against the snow. The battered fuselage was left behind, half buried as it had been during their long captivity. In the days that followed, the survivors began to piece together what they had endured. Doctors treated frostbite and malnutrition. Psychologists tried to help them confront the trauma. But the emotional weight of their choices in the mountains, the unthinkable steps they had taken to stay alive, would take far longer to heal. Yet amid the sorrow there was profound gratitude. Gratitude for the muleteer who had listened, for the helicopter crews who braved thin air and mountain winds, and above all, for one another. They had emerged from the white abyss not as a team of rugby players, but as a band of brothers, bound by an unshakable bond.
In the weeks that followed their rescue, the 16 survivors found themselves thrust from the silent white wilderness into the blinding spotlight of the world's attention. Hospitals in Santiago were crowded with reporters eager for every detail of their ordeal. Flashbulbs popped as the men, pale and gaunt in hospital gowns, shielded their eyes from the glare. For the first time in 72 days, they were warm, fed, and safe. Yet each carried invisible wounds. Their bodies, though weak and frostbitten, could heal with time. Their hearts would need longer. Nando Carrado often sat by a hospital window staring at the distant mountains. To others he looked calm, but behind his eyes lived the memory of the fuselage buried in snow, of his mother's still form beside him, of his sister Eugenia's final breath. At night, dreams would carry him back to the howling wind and the cracking ice. Roberto Canessa, hailed by the press as the student doctor who saved lives, felt a weight no headline could describe, the memory of the choices they had made in the valley to stay alive. He spoke sparingly to reporters, offering only gratitude for the Chilean rescuers and prayers for the dead. Public reaction to their story was a mixture of awe and sorrow. Many hailed them as heroes, symbols of human endurance in the harshest conditions. Others, hearing of the measures they had taken to survive, whispered judgments born of misunderstanding. But the survivors remained united, refusing to feel shame for having clung to life when all hope had been stripped away. Back in Montevideo, Uruguay, families of the survivors and of the dead gathered for memorial masses. Churches filled with candlelight and the scent of lilies as priests intoned prayers for the souls lost in the mountains. When the survivors finally returned home, they were met with tearful embraces. The rugby club, once known for bright jerseys and friendly matches, was now immortalized as a symbol of resilience. Months later, some of them began to speak publicly, not to sensationalize the tragedy, but to honor the memory of those who had not come home. They told their story to remind others of the strength that can rise within ordinary people when tested beyond endurance. The site of the crash became known as El Valle de las Lágrimas, the Valley of Tears.
A wooden cross erected at the place where the fuselage once lay bore the names of the 29 who had perished. Over time, the seasons softened the scars of the avalanche. Spring thaw brought wildflowers to the edges of the snowfields. But the mountains never forgot. For the survivors, the journey of healing was uneven. Some returned to their studies or professions. Others found solace in faith or in writing their memories. Nando Parado eventually authored a memoir titled Miracle in the Andes, offering a moving reflection on love, loss, and the fierce will to survive. The friendships forged in the crucible of the Andes endured for decades. Each anniversary of the crash, they gathered to light candles and read aloud the names of their fallen friends, teammates whose laughter still echoed in memory. To later generations, their story became a testament not just to survival, but to the depths of human compassion. In the face of starvation, they had chosen to preserve one another's lives. In the face of despair, they had found reason to keep walking forward. Documentaries and films would later depict their ordeal, sometimes dramatized, sometimes softened for audiences. But the real story, told by those who lived it, carried a quiet gravity that no script could fully capture. The sight of sunlight glinting off endless white ridges, the stillness after the crash, the slow rhythm of footsteps cutting across frozen silence. Even decades later, those who survived said that sometimes, in dreams, they heard again the distant hum of the airplane's engines just before the first jolt of impact, or the sighing wind that curled around the fuselage at night. These were the echoes of the mountains, reminders that the experience had marked them for life. Yet there was light, too. Many of them spoke of how the ordeal had taught them to cherish simple things, the warmth of bread fresh from the oven, the laughter of family at a dinner table, the feeling of grass beneath bare feet. Survival had sharpened their sense of what truly mattered. In the years since, travelers have occasionally made the trek to the Valley of Tears, some to honor loved ones, others out of reverence for the courage displayed there. They often leave small crosses or notes weighted down with stones, tributes to strangers whose will to live inspired the world. Standing at the site today, one can hear the wind keening across the slopes and imagine, just for a moment, the fuselage half buried in snow, the flicker of firelight inside, the silhouettes of young men huddled close together against the cold. The Andes plane crash of 1972 was a tragedy that claimed many lives, but it also revealed the profound strength of the human spirit. Against merciless nature, without tools or hope of rescue, 16 young men endured and returned to tell the world what it means to cling to life when all else is lost. Their story remains a beacon that even in the loneliest and harshest places on earth, courage and love can carve a path home.